Somewhere in the middle of the 14th century, the world was a quieter place than it is today. There were no engines humming in the distance, no electric lights glowing through the night, no screens casting their soft blue radiance across darkened rooms. The nights were genuinely dark, lit only by candles and halves and the slow movement of stars across an unobscured sky. People lived close to the rhythms of the natural world in a way that is difficult to fully imagine now. They woke when the light came and rested when it faded. They knew the names of the plants growing at the edges of their fields. They understood the turning of the seasons in an intimate, personal way, because the seasons shaped everything about how they lived. Europe in the early 1400s was a patchwork of small kingdoms and city-states, of feudal manors and modest market towns, of monasteries perched on hillsides and fishing villages nestled along cold coastlines. Most people lived in the countryside. The cities that existed were busy and crowded by the standards of the time, but they would seem small and quiet to modern eyes. London, which was one of the largest cities in England, held perhaps 80,000 people at its peak before the middle of the century. Paris was somewhat larger. Many towns that were considered significant in their region held only a few thousand souls. Life was organized around the land, around the church, and around the rhythms of agricultural seasons that determined whether a community would eat well or go hungry in the months ahead. The villages of medieval Europe had a particular character that is worth dwelling on for a moment. They were not uniform. They varied considerably depending on where you were, whether you were in the warm plains of southern France or the cooler, damper lowlands of the Netherlands, whether you were in the rolling hills of Tuscany or the forested valleys of Germany. But they shared certain qualities. They were small enough that nearly everyone knew everyone else. The social world of a medieval village was intimate in a way that modern life rarely is. You were born into a community and you generally remained within it for your entire life. The faces around you at market day were the faces of people you had known since childhood. The priest who led the prayers on Sunday had likely baptized you and would likely perform your funeral rites when the time came. The physical structure of a village typically centered on a few key elements. There was usually a church, which was often the largest and most permanent building in the settlement. Churches were built of stone when the community could manage it, and their presence gave the village a kind of anchor, a sense of continuity across generations. Surrounding the church was often a small churchyard, where the community buried its dead and where children sometimes played on quiet afternoons. The church was not merely a place of worship in the modern sense. It was the center of community life in a broader way. It was where important announcements were made, where disputes were sometimes settled, where people gathered not only for religious observances but for the marking of every significant moment in a human life. Beyond the church, a village would typically have a cluster of homes, most of them modest by any measure. The typical peasant dwelling of the period was a simple structure. In many parts of Europe it consisted of a single large room, sometimes with a small adjoining space for animals during the coldest months of winter. The walls might be made of timber and plaster, or of stone, or of packed earth depending on what materials were locally available. Roofs were commonly thatched with straw or reeds. Windows were small, both to conserve warmth and because glass was expensive and not commonly used in ordinary homes. Light came from the hearth fire and from simple candles made of tallow, which produced a soft, slightly smoky glow. The interiors of these homes were not bare or entirely cheerless. Families accumulated modest possessions over time. There were wooden chests for storage, simple furniture, perhaps a few ceramic pots and iron cooking implements. Walls might be hung with rough cloth to cut the drafts. The floor was often hard-packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that could be changed periodically. Life inside these homes followed a rhythm that was tied closely to the hours of daylight. In summer, when the days were long, there was much to do and the pace of agricultural work was relentless. Crops needed tending, animals needed care. The constant labor of maintaining a holding against the encroachments of weather and time and the unpredictability of nature never entirely ceased. In winter, when the days shortened and the cold settled in, life slowed considerably. There was still work to be done, repairs and mending and the care of animals, but the urgent outdoor labor of warmer months gave way to a quieter domestic pace. People gathered closer to their fires, told stories, mended tools and clothing, and slept longer hours. Food in the medieval period was simple and largely dependent on what the local land could produce. For most people, bread was the foundation of the diet. It was typically made from wheat, rye, or a mixture of grains depending on the region, and it was dense and filling, the kind of bread that sustained people through long days of physical work. Alongside bread, people ate pottage, which was a thick soup or stew made by simmering whatever vegetables and grains were available in a pot over the fire. Peas and beans were important sources of protein. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips appeared frequently. Onions and garlic were widely grown and used for flavoring. Meat was eaten but was not the centerpiece of every meal for ordinary people. Chickens were kept for eggs. Pigs were valuable animals because they could be fed on scraps and forage and would eventually provide a substantial supply of preserved meat for the winter months. Salting and smoking were the primary methods of preservation, and the autumn slaughter of livestock was an important event in the agricultural calendar. The fields surrounding a medieval village were typically organized according to a system that seems complex to modern eyes but made good sense in the context of the time. In many parts of northern Europe, the open field system was common. Under this arrangement, the arable land around a village was divided into large fields, and each family held strips of land scattered across these fields rather than a single consolidated plot. This had the effect of spreading both the good land and the poorer land more or less equitably among the households. One of the large fields would typically be left fallow each year, resting and recovering its fertility while the others were cultivated. The fallow field would be grazed by animals, whose manure helped to restore the soil. This rotation was not a formal scientific principle but a practical tradition accumulated over many generations of observation and experience. Beyond the cultivated fields lay the common land, which was shared by all the villagers and was an essential resource. The common included pasture where animals could graze, woodland where families could gather firewood and cut timber, and sometimes marshy areas that provided reeds for thatching and thatch. Access to the common was carefully regulated by custom, with each household entitled to use it according to traditional arrangements. The woodland was particularly valuable. Wood was the primary fuel and building material of the period, and its management was taken seriously. Coppicing, the practice of cutting trees in a way that encouraged them to regrow in dense, harvestable growth, was widely practiced and produced a steady supply of poles and small timber for a variety of purposes. The social structure of a medieval village was layered and hierarchical, but the hierarchy was also intimate and personal in a way that large societies rarely are. At the top was the lord of the manor, who might be a nobleman or a knight or sometimes the church itself, in cases where monastic houses held land. The lord was owed certain obligations by the peasants who lived on his land, including labor services and a portion of the harvest. In return, the lord was expected to provide protection and to maintain the mill and other communal facilities. The relationship varied considerably in practice, and by the early 14th century in many parts of Europe it had already begun to loosen from its original strict feudal character, with labor services increasingly being commuted to cash payments. Below the lord in the village hierarchy were the peasants themselves, who were not a uniform group. Some held relatively substantial amounts of land and were considered prosperous by the standards of the time. Others held very little and supplemented their agricultural work with craft trades or seasonal labor. At the bottom were the landless poor, who depended entirely on wage labor and the generosity of neighbors and the church for their survival. The distinctions between these groups were real and mattered in daily life, but everyone in a small village knew everyone else, and the social fabric was woven through with shared obligations, mutual dependencies, and long-standing relationships. The church played a role in medieval life that extended far beyond Sunday worship. It was the keeper of time in a very literal sense. The canonical hours, the traditional divisions of the monastic day into periods of prayer, provided the rhythm by which time was measured and announced. Church bells rang at regular intervals through the day, marking the hours and calling the community to awareness of the passage of time. For people who had no personal timekeeping devices, the church bells were the clock by which they organized their days. The bells also marked other important moments, ringing at births and deaths and on feast days, creating a kind of acoustic landscape that gave shape to both the daily and the annual cycle. The religious calendar of medieval Christianity was rich with feasts and fasting periods, with saints' days and commemorations, with cycles of celebration and penitence that gave a particular texture to the passage of the year. Christmas and Easter were the two great anchoring celebrations, marking the darkest point of winter and the return of spring respectively. But there were many other feast days scattered through the year, and these were genuine holidays in the original sense of the word, holy days on which ordinary work ceased and the community gathered for celebration. Markets were often held on feast days, and the combination of religious observance and commercial activity made these days important social events as well as spiritual ones. Pilgrimage was a common feature of medieval religious life, and it brought movement and connection into what might otherwise seem like a very static world. People traveled to visit the shrines of saints, both local and distant, seeking healing or spiritual merit or simply the experience of journey and discovery. The great pilgrimage routes of medieval Europe were genuinely busy with travelers, and they supported a network of hostels and churches and market towns along the way. The Canterbury Pilgrims of Geoffrey Chaucer's famous poem were a real social type, a cross-section of medieval society thrown together by a shared journey and the particular loosening of social hierarchies that travel tended to produce. Trade connected even seemingly isolated medieval communities to a wider world. The great trading routes of medieval Europe moved wool and cloth, wine and grain, spices and metals across surprising distances. The Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant cities along the Baltic and North Sea coasts, was already a significant economic force in the early 14th century, moving goods between Scandinavia, England, the Low Countries, and the Baltic regions in a network of commerce that required considerable organization and trust. The Champagne fairs in France attracted merchants from across Europe. Italian banking houses had established branches in cities far from their home cities, and the letters of credit they had developed allowed capital to move across distances without the physical transportation of coin. For ordinary village people, the connection to this wider trading world was indirect but real. The cloth merchant who appeared at the local market might be dealing in fabric that had passed through several hands and several hundred miles before reaching him. The spices that a prosperous household used to season their food had traveled from Asia along trade routes of extraordinary length. The coins that changed hands at market day circulated through networks that stretched across political boundaries and natural barriers. The world of medieval Europe was more connected than it sometimes appears in retrospect. The towns and cities of medieval Europe were different in kind from the villages, not just in size. They had a particular energy and a particular set of institutions that set them apart. The guild system, which organized craft production in most medieval cities, was one of the defining features of urban life. Guilds were associations of craftsmen in a particular trade, and they regulated the production and sale of goods, maintained quality standards, and managed the training of new craftsmen through the formal progression from apprentice to journeyman to master. They also served important social functions, providing mutual aid to members in difficulty and organizing collective religious observances. The streets of a medieval city were narrow and irregular by modern standards, lined with buildings that often extended outward on upper floors to the point where they nearly touched across the street above. The ground floors of many buildings in commercial areas were given over to shops, open to the street through wide shuttered openings that could be closed at night. The smells of a medieval city were complex and would strike a modern visitor as overwhelming. There were the smells of animals, because livestock were kept in cities and driven through city streets regularly. There were the smells of various craft trades, tanning and dyeing and metalworking and food preparation, all conducted in close proximity to residential spaces. There was the smell of cooking fires and the organic smell of a city without modern sanitation systems. Despite this, medieval cities were not uniformly grim places. They had a vitality and a density of human activity that made them exciting centers of culture and commerce. They attracted people from the surrounding countryside seeking economic opportunity. They supported craftsmen and merchants, scholars and clergy, laborers and entertainers. The larger cities had permanent market squares where commercial life concentrated, and these spaces were genuinely lively centers of social interaction. People came not only to buy and sell but to exchange news, to see and be seen, to conduct the informal social business that community life requires. Water was a fundamental concern for any medieval settlement. Access to clean water for drinking and cooking was a constant practical challenge. Wells were the primary source of water for most households in villages and towns alike. In cities, public fountains fed by aqueducts or pipes were sometimes available, particularly in the cities of Mediterranean Europe where the Roman tradition of water engineering had left a legacy that medieval municipalities worked to maintain and sometimes extend. Rivers and streams served multiple purposes simultaneously, as sources of drinking water, as power sources for mills, as disposal channels for waste, and as transportation routes. This multipurpose use created tensions that were not always well resolved. Mills were among the most important pieces of infrastructure in the medieval world. Watermills used the energy of flowing streams to grind grain into flour, a task that would otherwise require enormous amounts of human labor. The mill was typically owned by the lord of the manor, and peasants were required to bring their grain to be ground there, paying a portion as a fee. This arrangement was sometimes resented, but the mill itself was a genuine asset to the community, concentrating the heavy work of grain processing in a way that freed human energy for other tasks. Windmills, which appeared in northern Europe during the medieval period and spread gradually, served a similar function in areas where reliable water power was not available. The landscape of medieval Europe was more heavily forested than it is today, but it was also more actively managed. The forests were not wild and untouched. They were resources, carefully if informally supervised, providing timber, fuel, game, and forage. The rights to various forest resources were often carefully specified and jealously guarded. The right to take certain amounts of wood, the right to pasture pigs in the forest to eat acorns in autumn, the right to hunt certain kinds of animals, these were all defined and regulated by custom and law. Deer and other large game were typically the preserve of the nobility, and poaching was taken seriously as an offense not merely against property but against the social order. The sea was a constant presence along the long coastlines of Europe, and fishing communities had their own particular character, shaped by the rhythms of tide and weather and the seasonal movements of fish. The herring fisheries of the North Sea and the Baltic were economically significant, producing salted and smoked fish that was traded across the continent and provided an important source of protein, particularly during the fasting periods that the Church prescribed. Coastal communities were often more outward-looking than inland villages, connected to distant places by trade and by the movement of ships. Sailors brought news from distant ports, and the harbors of coastal towns were places where information as well as goods arrived from far away. The intellectual life of medieval Europe was centered on the church and on the universities that had grown up during the 12th and 13th centuries. The great cathedral schools of the high medieval period had, in several cases, evolved into something recognizable as universities, with formal structures for teaching and the award of degrees. Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and Salamanca were among the most significant, attracting students from across Europe who came to study theology, law, medicine, and philosophy. The curriculum was organized around classical and early Christian texts, with Aristotle holding a particularly central place. The great intellectual project of the high medieval period had been the synthesis of classical Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle, with Christian theology, a project most associated with the Dominican friar Thomas Aquinas, who worked in the middle of the 13th century. Knowledge in the medieval world was preserved and transmitted primarily through manuscripts, hand-copied books produced mainly in monastic scriptoria. This was slow and expensive work, and the availability of books was limited compared to what printing would later make possible. but the monasteries were genuine centers of learning and of the preservation of ancient texts. Monks copied not only theological works but also classical texts in Latin, works of science and philosophy and poetry that would otherwise have been lost. The great monastic libraries held treasures of accumulated knowledge, and the scholars who had access to them were working with a surprisingly broad base of inherited understanding. Medicine in the medieval period was a complex mixture of rational observation, ancient theory, and religious practice. The dominant medical theory was still the humoral system inherited from ancient Greece, which understood the body as governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance or imbalance determined health and illness. Treatment was aimed at restoring the proper balance through diet, exercise, bleeding, purging, and the application of herbs with specific properties. The herbal knowledge of the period was substantial and in many cases practically effective. Plants like willow bark, which contains compounds related to modern aspirin, were known to reduce fever and pain. The gardens of monasteries typically included herb gardens maintained specifically for medical purposes. Physicians who had received formal training were relatively rare and expensive, available mainly to the wealthy. Most people received their medical care from a variety of other sources. Barber surgeons performed practical procedures including bloodletting, tooth extraction, and wound care. Apothecaries compounded and sold herbal preparations. Wise women in villages and towns maintained knowledge of herbal remedies passed down through generations. And the shrines of saints were believed to have healing power, drawing the sick and injured to seek miraculous cures through prayer and pilgrimage. Death was a more visible and familiar presence in medieval life than it tends to be in modern Western societies. People died at home, surrounded by family. Children were present at deaths, and the rituals surrounding dying and burial were communal affairs. The Church provided a structured framework for approaching death, with a series of rites that prepared both the dying person and the community for the transition. Last rites, including confession, anointing, and the reception of communion, were considered essential for a good death, and considerable anxiety attached to the possibility of dying suddenly without proper preparation. The dead were buried in the churchyard, in ground sanctified by the Church and surrounded by the ongoing life of the community. The graves of ancestors lay close to the spaces of daily life, and this proximity was not experienced as morbid but as a form of continuity. The years leading up to the middle of the 14th century had not been easy for much of Europe. The early decades of the century had brought a prolonged period of poor harvests and famine, a climatic shift toward cooler and wetter conditions that reduced crop yields across much of the continent. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had been a severe crisis in northern Europe, weakening the population significantly. The countryside had not fully recovered from this period of hardship when the next disruption arrived. The illness that changed the world arrived in Europe through its trading connections to Asia and the Middle East. The great overland and maritime trade routes that brought spices and silk and other valuable goods to European markets also carried, in this instance, something that could not be traded or controlled. The illness traveled along the same routes that merchants traveled, arriving first in port cities and then spreading gradually inland. It reached Sicily in 1347, carried by ships from the eastern Mediterranean. From Sicily it moved to the Italian mainland, and from Italy it spread through the trade networks that connected the continent. The illness moved at a pace that followed human movement. It was not instantaneous. It traveled along roads and river routes, along sea lanes and trade paths. Places that were more densely connected to the trading network tended to encounter it earlier. Remote communities, those far from the main routes of travel and commerce, sometimes had months or even a year or more of continued ordinary life after the illness had appeared in the nearest large city. The countryside, where most people lived, received it somewhat later than the towns. What the illness did to the body was not well understood at the time, and medieval physicians and scholars made efforts to explain it through the frameworks they had available. The humoral theory suggested that certain combinations of environmental conditions could corrupt the air, and corrupt air entering the body could disturb the humoral balance. Astrological explanations were also offered. In 1348, the medical faculty of the University of Paris produced an official explanation suggesting that a particular conjunction of planets had caused corruption in the air, and that this miasma was the source of the illness. This was not negligence or ignorance but the application of the best available theoretical framework to an unprecedented situation. The practical response to the illness was, in many places, to move away from it. When a community learned that a neighboring town had been struck, those who could afford to and had somewhere to go often departed for places believed to be safer. The wealthy had the greatest capacity for this kind of flight, as they had country properties to retreat to and the resources to support themselves during an extended absence. The poor were largely unable to leave, being tied to their work and their communities by necessity. This difference in capacity to flee meant that the illness spread in part along the routes taken by those trying to escape it, a pattern that would become familiar in later epidemics as well. In the cities, the experience of the illness was shaped by the density of urban life. People lived in close proximity in medieval cities, in multi-story buildings where multiple households shared staircases and courtyards, in neighborhoods where the streets were narrow enough that neighbors could almost touch across them. The water sources and waste disposal systems of medieval cities were intermingled in ways that would be recognized today as problematic. The conditions that made cities vibrant centers of commerce and culture also made them places where illness could spread efficiently. Communities developed various practical responses to the situation as it unfolded around them. Graveyards filled quickly in affected communities and had to be expanded. New burial grounds were opened outside the existing churchyards in many places. In some communities, the normal ceremonies surrounding burial were abbreviated or altered because of the sheer number of deaths and the difficulty of performing traditional rites for each individual. Priests and other clergy who continued to administer last rites to the dying were themselves frequently affected, and their numbers were reduced significantly in many communities. In Venice, which was one of the first major cities in Europe to be struck and which had a sophisticated administrative apparatus and a strong tradition of organized civic response, officials developed what may have been the first systematic quarantine measures. Ships arriving from affected areas were required to anchor in the harbor for a period before passengers and crew were permitted to disembark. This practice of isolation, of holding potentially exposed individuals apart from the general population for a defined period, was a genuinely rational response developed through observation and practical reasoning. The word quarantine itself derives from the Italian for 40 days, the period originally specified for this isolation. The economic effects of the illness began to manifest as it moved through communities. Agricultural work is seasonal and cannot easily be deferred, and the reduction in the labor force meant that in some areas crops went unharvested in the autumn. The labor of plowing and planting, the care of livestock, the management of the harvest, all of this required hands, and in some places those hands were simply not available in sufficient numbers. The records of many manors and estates from the years during and immediately after the epidemic show disrupted payments, uncultivated fields, and the disappearance of names from rent rolls that had previously been stable across generations. The price of labor began to change as its scarcity became apparent. Workers who survived found themselves in a different economic position than they had occupied before, simply because there were fewer of them relative to the amount of work that needed to be done. This shift was not immediately dramatic, and its effects played out over years and decades, but it represented a genuine change in the underlying economics of the rural world that would have long-term consequences for the social structure of medieval Europe. The Church was deeply affected by what had happened. A significant number of clergy had died in the course of administering to the sick and dying. Replacements needed to be found and trained, and the urgency of the need meant that the usual standards for education and formation were sometimes set aside. Critics would later argue that the quality of the clergy had declined as a result, and while this judgment may be oversimplified, it reflects a genuine disruption in the normal processes by which the Church reproduced and trained its personnel. The monasteries, which had been centers of learning and preservation, were affected in ways that varied considerably. Some communities were devastated. Others, in more remote locations or under abbots who enforced strict isolation, survived with fewer losses. The disruption to monastic life, to the copying of manuscripts and the maintenance of libraries and the education of novices, was real in many places, though the long-term effects on intellectual culture were not as severe as they might have been. The aftermath of the epidemic unfolded slowly over the following decades. Demographic recovery took generations. Population levels in many parts of Europe that had been reduced significantly would not return to their pre-epidemic levels for a century or more. This prolonged demographic weakness shaped the economics and society of the period in ways that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The shortage of labor that the epidemic had created persisted for decades, and its effects on the relationship between landowners and peasants were significant. The economic leverage of surviving peasants increased because their labor was more scarce and therefore more valuable. In some parts of Europe, this led to a gradual loosening of the remaining constraints of the old feudal system. In England, attempts by landowners and the Crown to maintain pre-epidemic wage rates through legislation contributed to social tensions that eventually erupted in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. In France, similar tensions produced their own upheavals. The social order that had seemed stable and permanent proved to be more fragile than it had appeared. The architecture of many medieval communities changed in the century following the epidemic. Land that had been densely settled was in some cases abandoned as populations fell and the practical need to cultivate every available acre diminished. Deserted villages, settlements that were simply emptied out and never repopulated, are a feature of the medieval landscape in many parts of Europe, their former existence now detectable only in the traces left in the soil and the slight undulations of the ground that mark where buildings once stood. Other villages shrank, their remaining population clustering closer together in a reduced settlement. Art and religious expression in the period following the epidemic had a particular quality that is recognizable in retrospect. The image of death as a skeletal figure, the personified death of the Dance of Death tradition, became more prominent in European visual and literary culture in the latter half of the 14th century. This was not merely a response to grief or trauma, but also a reflection of a changed relationship to mortality in a society that had experienced collective death at an unusual scale. The awareness of death's nearness and universality, which had always been part of Christian teaching, took on a more vivid and personal quality in the artistic expression of the period. The religious climate of the later 14th century was complex and somewhat unsettled. The authority of the institutional church, which had already been complicated by political conflicts in the earlier part of the century, including the prolonged period when the papacy was based in Avignon rather than Rome, was further complicated by the sense of religious questioning that the epidemic had encouraged in some people. Why had God permitted this to happen? What was the meaning of so much suffering? The traditional answers of the Church were not universally satisfying, and alternative religious movements, some of which would eventually be identified as heretical, found audiences in the decades following. The flagellants were one of the more striking religious movements of the epidemic period. Groups of men moved from town to town performing public acts of self-mortification, beating themselves in elaborate rituals intended as acts of penance and propitiation. These movements attracted considerable crowds and had a genuinely popular character, though the institutional church viewed them with concern and eventually condemned the practice. They represented an attempt to find meaning in collective suffering through an intensification of religious expression that bypassed the usual channels of the institutional church. Other responses to the epidemic were more straightforwardly practical. Jewish communities in many European cities were subjected to accusations that they had caused the illness by poisoning wells, a charge that was entirely without foundation but which found a willing audience in communities searching for explanations and in some cases for someone to blame. Pogroms, attacks on Jewish communities, occurred in numerous cities, particularly in the German-speaking lands. The papacy issued bulls condemning these attacks and pointing out that Jews were dying of the illness just as Christians were, but the violence continued in many places. This represents one of the darker aspects of the period, the way that collective stress can find expression in scapegoating and violence against vulnerable minorities. The medical profession reflected seriously on the epidemic and its implications in the years that followed. New observations about how illness seemed to spread, the pattern of its movement between people and places, led to practical measures that went beyond the existing theoretical framework. The quarantine measures developed in Italian port cities were refined and formalized. Sanitary regulations in cities were sometimes strengthened, though the germ theory of disease that would have provided a rational basis for such measures was still centuries away from development. The empirical observation that something about proximity to sick individuals increased one's chance of becoming ill was acted upon practically even without a clear theoretical understanding of why this was so. Trade routes and patterns shifted somewhat in the years following the epidemic, partly as a result of the demographic changes and partly due to the disruptions to specific communities that had been trading partners. Some routes that had been busy became quieter. Other routes, particularly those connecting regions less severely affected, sometimes became more important. The great Hanseatic trading network continued to function, though with adjustments. Italian banking and merchant houses, some of which had been severely disrupted by the epidemic and by related financial crises, reorganized and in some cases emerged from the period in a stronger position than before. The countryside, which had been the site of most of medieval life, changed gradually over the following decades. The relative increase in the economic power of surviving peasants, combined with the availability of land abandoned by those who had died, created conditions in which some families could improve their holdings significantly. By the latter part of the 14th century, there are records in many parts of England and France of peasant families holding considerably more land than would have been typical a generation earlier. The accumulation of abandoned holdings by surviving families changed the distribution of agricultural land in ways that had long-term consequences for rural social structure. Sheep farming expanded in some regions during this period, partly as a consequence of the labor dynamics. Sheep require less intensive labor than arable farming, and in regions where there was insufficient labor to cultivate all available arable land, converting some of that land to pasture was a rational response. In England in particular, the expansion of sheep pasture and the wool trade that it supported had significant effects on the rural landscape and on the communities that had previously farmed the converted land. The towns and cities, which had been struck heavily, began the slow process of demographic recovery. New arrivals from the countryside, attracted by the economic opportunities that urban centers continued to offer even in their reduced state, helped to replenish urban populations. This rural to urban migration was not new. It had been a feature of medieval social geography for centuries, but it took on increased importance in the demographic recovery period. The cities that recovered fastest were generally those best positioned on trade routes and those with the most dynamic economic sectors. Craft production and trade continued through the period of recovery, adapting to changed conditions. The reduction in the labor force pushed wages up in many trades, improving the material conditions of surviving workers. The guild system continued to function as the organizing framework for urban craft production, though the guilds too had to adapt to the changed demographic landscape. Standards for admission to guilds were sometimes relaxed during periods of acute shortage, then tightened again as conditions normalized. The universities, which had been affected by the disruptions of the epidemic period, gradually restabilized. The intellectual traditions they embodied, the study of theology and law and medicine and philosophy, continued. New generations of students came to study, new masters taught, new books were produced and debated. The intellectual culture of the later 14th century showed both continuity with what had come before and some new directions. The experience of the epidemic had expanded the observational basis of medical knowledge, and the questions about meaning and authority raised by the period of crisis contributed to an intellectual restlessness that would eventually find expression in the reform movements of the 15th and 16th centuries. The natural world continued its own rhythms through all of this. The fields were plowed and planted each spring, the harvest came each autumn, the seasons turned in their accustomed order regardless of what was happening in human society. The forests continued to grow. The rivers ran as they always had. Birds migrated according to their ancient patterns. The continuity of the natural world provided a kind of backdrop against which the disruptions of human life unfolded and eventually quieted. The generation that grew up after the epidemic, the children born in the 1350s and 1360s who came of age in a world already beginning to recover, knew the epidemic mainly through the stories of their parents and grandparents, through the visible evidence of reduced populations and abandoned farmsteads, and through the cultural and religious expressions it had produced. For them, the world as they found it was simply the world. The changes it had undergone were the conditions of their existence rather than departures from a remembered normality. By the end of the 14th century, European society was different in a number of significant ways from what it had been at the beginning. The feudal structures that had organized rural life were looser. The economic position of peasants in many regions had improved. The church, while still enormously powerful and central to daily life, faced new currents of questioning and criticism. The cities had changed in their composition and in some of their physical character. The art and literature of the period bore the marks of what had been experienced. And yet the continuities were as striking as the changes. People still lived primarily in small communities tied to agricultural land. They still organized their time around the rhythms of the natural and liturgical year. They still marked the significant passages of life with the same ceremonies and in the same places. They still gathered around fires in the evenings and told stories. They still knew the names of the plants growing at the edges of their fields. The basic texture of daily life, its smells and sounds and the quality of its light, its intimacy and its connection to the physical world, these things persisted through all the disruptions. The England of Chaucer, who was writing his Canterbury Tales in the 1380s and 1390s, was a different England from the one that had existed a generation earlier, but it was recognizably England still. His pilgrims, that diverse group of travellers making their way through the Kent countryside to the shrine of Thomas Becket, were people shaped by everything the century had brought, but they were also people fully engaged in the everyday business of living, trading, arguing, telling stories, seeking healing, making jokes, falling in love, navigating the endlessly complex social world of human community. The medieval world, viewed from this gentle distance, had a particular quality that is hard to name precisely. It was a world in which the boundaries between the human and the natural were much more porous than they are now. It was a world in which the great questions of meaning and mortality were woven into the fabric of ordinary life rather than set apart in specialized spaces. It was a world in which community was not a choice but a condition of existence, in which the faces around you were the faces of people whose lives were deeply entwined with your own. The 14th century, for all its difficulties, was also a century of remarkable cultural production. The poetry of Chaucer in England, of Petrarch and Boccaccio in Italy, the philosophical work of William of Ockham, the mystical writings of figures like Julian of Norwich, who wrote with remarkable calm and depth about her own experiences of illness and spiritual vision, these were not the products of a world in decline but of a world in the midst of complex transformation, a world working through great challenges with the resources it had available. Julian of Norwich, who wrote in the latter half of the 14th century, had a particular quality of serenity in her reflections that is striking given the period in which she lived. Her most famous phrase, that all shall be well and all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well, was not a denial of difficulty but an affirmation of a deeper order underlying the apparent chaos of experience. It was the kind of statement that could only be made by someone who had looked directly at difficulty and had found, in the looking, something that extended beyond it. The slow recovery of European population continued through the 15th century. The pace varied by region and by the specific demographic conditions of each area. In some places, particularly those that had been struck hardest and had suffered additional losses in subsequent outbreaks, recovery was slower. In others, it was quicker. But the general direction was toward gradual replenishment, toward the slow refilling of the demographic space that had been opened by the middle of the 14th century. New generations grew up with the particular characteristics of their time, shaped by the economic conditions and cultural currents of the recovering world. The increased availability of land, the somewhat higher wages of surviving workers, the loosening of feudal obligations in many regions, these created conditions that were in some ways more favorable for ordinary people than those that had existed before the epidemic. This is not to minimize what had been lost, but to note that history does not move in simple directions. Disruption, even when terrible, can produce changes that are not entirely negative in their long-term effects. The monasteries, which had been centers of learning and preservation through the centuries of the early medieval period, continued in their role through the 14th century and beyond, though their cultural dominance was slowly being shared with other institutions. The universities were becoming more important as centers of intellectual life. The growth of literate culture outside the church, among merchants and nobility and eventually among wider urban populations, was slowly changing the cultural landscape. The technology of printing, still a century away, would eventually transform this process, but the roots of that transformation were already present in the expanding literacy and book culture of the later medieval period. The landscapes of Europe in the late 14th and early 15th centuries had a particular quality, marked by both the traces of what had been and the new growth of what was becoming. Abandoned farmsteads slowly disappeared back into vegetation, their timber rotting, their plaster crumbling, the fieldstone of their walls eventually being taken by neighboring communities for new construction. The fields that had been left untilled in the immediate aftermath of the epidemic had in most cases been brought back into cultivation or converted to pasture. The villages that survived were intact communities with their own memories and their own ongoing stories. The roads continued to connect these communities, the same roads that had carried the illness along their length, now carrying the ordinary traffic of trade and pilgrimage and seasonal movement. Pack horses and carts moved between market towns. Pilgrims made their way to shrines. Merchants traveled their circuits. Seasonal laborers moved toward the regions where work was available. Friars walked the roads in their worn habits, preaching in towns and villages along their routes. The roads were alive with human movement, as they had always been, as they would continue to be. The sky above this landscape was as it had always been. The same stars moved through their slow courses above the quiet fields and the sleeping towns. The same moon tracked its monthly cycle across the sky, its light falling on the same stone walls and thatch roofs that had sheltered human lives for generations before and would shelter them for generations after. The same seasons turned in their accustomed order, bringing cold and warmth, rain and dry, the long days of summer and the short days of winter, in the same rhythm that they had maintained as long as there had been anyone to notice them. In this rhythm, in this continuity, there was something quietly reassuring. The world that the 14th century had disrupted was also the world that had absorbed the disruption and continued. The communities that had been reduced had also recovered. The cultural traditions that had been challenged had also endured and in some ways deepened. The people of the late 14th century were living in a world that bore the marks of what had happened, but they were also living in a world that was simply, in the most fundamental sense, continuing. The evenings in a medieval village at the end of the 14th century would have had a particular quality of quiet. After the work of the day was done and the evening meal consumed, as the light faded and the fire settled into coals, the sounds of the village would have been simple and familiar. The distant lowing of cattle, the sound of wind in the thatch, a child's voice somewhere, the low murmur of conversation in a neighboring house. The darkness was genuine darkness, soft and encompassing, and the sky above was thick with stars. Sleep came naturally in such conditions, in the warmth of the fire and the safety of familiar walls, in the company of those who were known and trusted. The morning would come, as it always did, with the gradual lightening of the sky and the sounds of the village waking, and the day would unfold in its accustomed way, with its particular mixture of labor and rest, of community and solitude, of the familiar and the occasionally surprising. This is how it had been for a very long time, and this is how it would continue to be, in the slow and patient rhythm of ordinary human life finding its way through the years.